For many Americans, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy 50 years ago marked the end of hope and optimism in the United States. Hope that there would be a quick end to the Vietnam War. Optimism that racial tensions in America could be eased. A court ruled that a lone gunman, a Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan, killed Senator Robert Kennedy. But recently, Robert Kennedy Jr. visited Sirhan Sirhan in prison and came away convinced that he was not the man who shot his father and that a second gunman was involved. Someone who agrees with that conclusion is former Allegheny County Coroner and forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was involved in the autopsy on Robert F. Kennedy 50 years ago. Dr. Wecht, welcome back to Primal Interviews.
Good to be with you again, Paul.
Do you think that Sirhan Sirhan had anything to do with Bobby Kennedy's assassination?
Well, he has something to do with it. Yes, he was there and he did shoot at the senator. What his motive was, I don't know. Whether he was under hypnosis, I don't know. There's no question about that. The issue for me as a forensic pathologist is whether there was a second shooter and whether the shots fired by Sirhan Sirhan caused the senator's death. The answer to that is that Sirhan Sirhan's shots did not kill Senator Kennedy. I don't believe that any of his shots struck Senator Kennedy. All the shots were fired from slightly to the right and slightly backward. Three of the shots did essentially nothing, one only in the clothing, two that entered the posterior top of the body, did not produce any significant damage. It would have been of no consequence. And then there was the fatal shot that struck the senator behind the ear. So those shots were not fired by Sirhan Sirhan. Now, you can go on from there. Was there complicity? Was this arranged? Did somebody know about it? These are other questions which indeed demand further investigation. But you've got to begin with this major assassination, this significant death of someone who would have been a presidential candidate, and I believe unquestionably would have been elected president. You've got to begin with the question of who then shot him and what was it all about. And then you'll find out where it all leads you.
Why do you believe that there was a second gunman?
The shot that killed Senator Kennedy was fired 1 to 1.5 inches from behind and slightly above his right ear. That is in the official autopsy report. That autopsy report, signed off by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, at that time Chief Medical Examiner, Coroner of Los Angeles, was also signed off on by some members of his staff, by some professors at USC, by 3 board-certified military forensic pathologists, and by 2 civilian forensic pathologists, Dr. William Eckert, now deceased, and me. So there's no question about that having been the finding, unequivocally and without any kind of question or deviation. Now, in addition to the pathological findings, both gross examination, looking at the wound, microscopic, taking the wound, making a section, studying it under the microscope to look for gunpowder residue to determine the range from which the shot was fired, there were ballistics tests. So they took that same .22 Ivor Johnson and they fired that weapon onto white paper. You fire from a distance of 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5, 2 inches, and so on. And you see the pattern of the stippling. That's like if you took a pen and dotted on a piece of paper, that's what we call stippling. It's from the burning and unburnt gunpowder particles coming out of the gun muzzle that land on the skin and actually produce the most superficial burns that would be of no consequence, but that's what we call stippling. And then gunpowder residue is the actual gunpowder from a close range shot coming onto the skin. So you do that testing with white paper, shooting at these different distances. Those ballistics studies confirmed, corroborated, were completely consistent with the gross microscopic findings from a pathology standpoint that Dr. Noguchi had made and with which all of us concurred. So there is no question about this. This is not something that one can conjecture upon. This is not something that somebody can say, well, I don't know what happened. Now, interestingly, some people are saying, well, maybe Sirhan was close, that close, and maybe Senator Kennedy turned. Nobody who was there has said that. One of the people wounded, Paul Schrade, who was wounded that night, talks about where he was standing, where the senator was. There were various other people. Roosevelt Greer was one of the bodyguards. Carl Euchre, the maitre d' of the hotel. I mean, it's not a matter of subjective interpretation. Nobody ever placed him near the senator 1 to 1.5 inches. Nowhere near. We're not talking about, are we quibbling here about a couple of inches? We're talking about feet. I know is amazing to people to hear, because they say to themselves, and understandably so, how come I never heard this before? How come this did not come out? If it came out, what did they do with it? The answer is very simple, as deplorable as it is. It never came out because it was never asked. Dr. Noguchi gave this testimony in the grand jury in the trial of Sirhan Sirhan. First of all, going into the trial for all those months beforehand, the defense attorney never consulted a forensic pathologist or a criminalist. This is an experienced criminal trial defense attorney. I do consultations all the time, and some of them, many of them, involve gun shooting and so on. I just did a couple within the past couple weeks. Everybody reaches out for a consultant. I mean, I'm just one of many across the length and breadth of the country. But I mean, I get it from private attorneys. I get it from public defenders. I get it from court-appointed attorneys. For Grant Cooper not to have consulted such an expert is absolutely inexplicable. And then, therefore, in the trial, he did not have that testimony in his presentation of the case in chief in the defense. But let's step back. The prosecution presents its case first in a murder trial. Then there's cross-examination. So there was Dr. Noguchi on the witness stand. So, you're the attorney, Mr. Cooper. Dr. Noguchi, what was the distance from which the fatal shot was fired? That question was never answered, never asked. And Dr. Noguchi had no way of just volunteering that. It is absolutely amazing, but go to the record and see. So when you ask me why, the only thing I can think of is that he made a deal with someone for whatever reason not to do it. There's no other explanation.
In the final rejection of Sirhan's appeals, U.S. Magistrate Judge Andrew Wistrich ruled, quote, even if the second shooter's bullet was the one that killed Senator Kennedy, Sirhan would be liable for murder as an aider and abettor, end quote. And if Sirhan was unaware of a second shooter, the judge wrote that the scenario of a second gunman who shot Kennedy, quote, at close range with the same type of gun and ammunition as Sirhan was using, but managed to escape the crowded room without notice of almost any of the room full of witnesses, lacks any evidentiary support, end quote. What about this?
Take the first part, that even if. That's a matter of law, that Sirhan was shooting, and therefore he could be charged with attempted murder. Whether he would be charged with murder, that's another matter. If it were proven that his shots did not strike the senator, then that's a legal question, which different legal minds might differ on. I'm not going to quibble on that, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that there would not have been serious criminal charges brought against Sirhan. Of course there would have been. My involvement in this matter, my discussion with you, my talking about this case and studying it for 50 years has nothing to do with the exoneration, exculpation, release from prison of Sirhan Sirhan. I mean, just as a person who has sensitivity and a sense of ethics and morality, yes, I think about that, but that's not the driving force that keeps me involved in this case. Now, let's talk about the second part of his statement. He goes on to say that all of that defies the imagination. Well, The fact of the matter is that Thane Eugene Caesar, who was a private security guard hired for that night to protect the senator, had a .22 revolver, and his gun was never taken and was never tested. And many, many months, years later, when they thought about it, they tried to get the gun. It had been sold to one person, it was sold to another person, and they went to the second buyer years later. Where was the gun? They traced him down. I think he was in Arkansas near the Texas border. Yes, he acknowledged that he had bought the gun, no problem. Where's the gun, sir? It was stolen from his home.
So you're saying that the security guard was the man who shot Senator Kennedy?
I can't say that he was the shooter. I'm saying it's a strong possibility because of where he was. Going back to Magistrate Judge Wistrich's comment, which is rather inane, that thinking that anybody could get out of there. Nobody questioned these other people. Nobody searched these other people. Nobody asked these other people, do you have a gun? They immediately seized upon Sirhan Sirhan. Now, I can understand that. There's Sirhan shooting and so on. But for the judge to make that statement that somebody got away with this because nobody did anything about it. Nobody said everybody will stay here, nobody will leave, we're going to search everybody, we're going to print everybody, we're going to do gunpowder residue on everybody's hands and so on. That was never done. So it's a stupid statement made by this judge, stupid. And I'll tell him that to his face, because the facts show that no such search was conducted. No such sequestration of people, searching of people was performed. So how can he make that statement to rule out the possibility of somebody doing it? Now, something that has been talked about, and I'm not saying that I can prove this, I'm just tossing it out. It has been suggested by various people that Sirhan Sirhan may well have been under hypnosis. Psychiatrists who studied and worked with him later on showed that he was extremely susceptible to hypnosis. He himself has said he remembers nothing about the shooting. He's been saying that now for these 50 years. I'm not suggesting that makes it true, that one accepts it as a valid statement, but it's something to think about. He's in prison for the rest of his life, so where are you going with that? What does it mean that he continues to say that? You got that episode of him going in for a drink before, and you got the situation involving a woman in a white polka dot dress who comes out screaming down the back steps, "We killed the senator. We killed Senator Kennedy." She was identified. Her name is Serrano. And they have tried to, in every way, disgrace and ridicule her statement. This is a woman, young woman, who had no reason to make this up, and yet that has never been pursued. So there's strong suggestion of some kind of a planned conspiracy. How Sirhan Sirhan came to be a part of it, whether it was voluntary or unconscious on his part, I can't tell you that for sure. These are things that would have to be explored. What I can tell you is, and I'm repeating myself, is that his shots did not kill Senator Kennedy. Somebody else's shots did. Now you begin with that. That's the problem with the authorities, local and federal. That's the problem. Just like with the John F. Kennedy assassination. Don't you see? They can't open that first door because that first door leads to who knows where. And I'm not telling you I know where. I think I know where with JFK. I'm not sure if I know where with RFK. But you've got to open up that first door. Then these other questions, who was Sirhan? Where did he come from? Did he know what he was doing? Was it planned? Who did the other shooting? We'll get to that. But you first have to say, hey man, there's no way that Sirhan Sirhan shot the shot that killed Senator Kennedy.
Dr. Wecht, I understand that Sirhan's mother asked you to be his lawyer.
Yes, Mrs. Sirhan called me. She called me on the phone. I remember with her accent. This is Mary Sirhan. I am the mother of Sirhan Sirhan. And she asked me whether I would be his lawyer. And it was very nice, of course, and I explained why I could not do it. That was back then in 1968. And at that time, I was chief forensic pathologist. I had 4 little kids. I was trying to make a living. I was involved in politics already and so on. I regret the answer I gave, because if I got the call today, and I am busier today than I was then, my answer would have been different. My answer would have been, Mrs. Sirhan, I myself can't handle the case, but I know some very excellent criminal defense attorneys that I can get on board, and I will work with them as an attorney and as a forensic pathologist. It will be my pleasure, Mrs. Sirhan. That would be my answer. I am very, very sorry that I just made a spontaneous answer, realizing that I could not do it, and that's it.
How did you end up getting involved with LA County Coroner Thomas Noguchi's autopsy on Bobby Kennedy?
Tom knew of my criticism of the Warren Commission, of the police, and how things were handled with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because I had given my paper at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences in February of 1965, and then I had written papers and came on strongly criticizing them on national television. So by 1968, Tom knew very well, from me personally, as well as just being a part of the overall community, what my thoughts were. So he wanted to find out from me, what could he do to keep them from taking Senator Kennedy's body away from his jurisdiction, which they had no legal right to do, but the feds obviously will do what they want to do. So I gave Tom some suggestions. I remember one of them was, contact Pierre Salinger, who was a native Californian and very close to the senator and his family, and get the message in that you want to do a thorough autopsy and so on. Do that as quickly as possible. And Tom, right away, now you get in touch with the military forensic pathologist stationed in Washington, D.C. at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and they were contemporaries, they were colleagues of ours. And you invite them as your professional guest to be present at the autopsy as observers. And he did that. And indeed, 3 military forensic pathologists came and attended the autopsy. So that's how I became involved. And then I went out shortly thereafter. I made a tour of the Ambassador Hotel with Dr. Noguchi. We discussed everything, and then I reviewed everything later on. So my involvement began hours after the senator had been shot and continued until the trial was over. My involvement at this time is not officially, and Dr. Noguchi is no longer the medical examiner. My involvement now is as an independent forensic pathologist and medical legal consultant, and I am very, very distressed by the fact that this case is not being reopened, despite all of this scientific evidence and pleas from many people, including, as I say, Paul Schrade and others who were present in that kitchen area of the Ambassador Hotel that evening.
Was Sirhan Sirhan the patsy in Robert Kennedy's assassination, much the same way that Lee Harvey Oswald was, as he called himself, the patsy in the JFK assassination? And if so, what was the motivation here?
Well, the motivation, according to the authorities, and I admit that there's something there that is tangible and within the realm of a reasonable analysis, that Sirhan had expressed some thoughts about Senator Kennedy, the Palestinians, with regard to Israel and so on, and Senator Kennedy's support of Israel. So that is a matter of record. And that is something that, again, would have to be dealt with and discussed. Is that all part of setting up the patsy? Keep in mind, if you are dealing with people at the level that I think are involved in this matter, I'm not talking about a couple of guys on the street will go and rape this girl, rob this bank, break into this home. We're talking about something at the highest possible level. To have worked things out over a period of weeks, months, days, to come to this kind of a setup would not have been anything that is beyond their ken, beyond their ability, something that you do. When you create a patsy, as they did with Lee Harvey Oswald, you don't create him the day before. This is something you work on. You're dealing with the pros. You're dealing with the top experts. So was he a patsy? That's indeed a very likely explanation. Was he a patsy that had any involvement, that knew what he was doing in part? That's yet another question, because you get back to the question of, was he under some kind of hypnotic spell? Was he going to be paid off? I don't know the answers to those questions. I can engage in conjecture with you over a cup of coffee, but my thoughts are no better or different or more expert than yours in that regard. So the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr. spent 3 hours with Sirhan Sirhan, came away convinced that Sirhan had no knowledge of his shooting, and convinced further that, based upon the evidence, Sirhan Sirhan did not fire the fatal shots. That's significant. I would have thought that it would have maybe led to a reopening of the door coming from the family. And Robert Kennedy Jr. was joined by his sister, Kathleen Townsend, a former lieutenant governor of the state of Maryland. And that still has not led to a reopening. It's amazing, it's surprising, and yet it's not. Because, you see, rather ironically, it makes me think even more definitely that there is something orchestrated at a higher level. Because if it weren't so, what's the problem with reopening cases? You know, there's nothing new about post-conviction hearings. You know, it's not as if, my God, who ever heard of anybody seeking a retrial? It doesn't happen frequently. I'm not telling, a small percentage get it. But here, in this case, and you have members of the family saying this, and you have this forensic scientific evidence, why can there not be a rehearing? That's, you know, that's, by the way, that's not a second trial right away. First, you have a post-conviction hearing. In the post-conviction hearing, then you present evidence, and at that point, the judge has to determine whether it constitutes a basis for a second trial. So please understand that. Not as if, you know, we're going to jump into court and have that second trial. So let's have the post-conviction hearing. What is the problem with that? What is the possible reason not to undertake a post-conviction hearing in light of this forensic scientific evidence that is firm and unequivocal, and in light of the implorations from the family? What is the reason that this is not being done? And you try to come up with a reason. There's got to be somebody involved in this. When I say somebody, some entity that doesn't want it to happen.
And were you immediately suspicious of a conspiracy? And I ask this because a lot of people back then, and even today, believe that with the timeline of 3 assassinations, President Kennedy in November of 1963, Martin Luther King assassinated less than 5 years later in April of 1968, and Bobby Kennedy 2 months later in June of 1968, that this could not have possibly been a coincidence, but instead some sort of organized conspiracy to wipe out liberals, to wipe out the progressives who were threatening what some people believed was their way of life.
I do believe that it is extremely unlikely for such a coincidence to occur, that these 3 people pursuing the kind of political agenda that they had, who were absolutely undefeatable, the 2 politicians, the president and the senator at the polls, and Martin Luther King with his following and so on. And the only way to eliminate those people was to do so physically. The only way to defeat them, the only way to bring them down You weren't going to beat Senator Kennedy. In 1968, he would have gone on to get the Democratic nomination and become elected. Go back and look at the results and see when Humphrey ran against Nixon. You weren't going to beat President Kennedy in the 1964 re-election campaign. So at that point, they were looking at 5 more years of John Kennedy, followed by 8 years of Bobby Kennedy. And you weren't going to bring down Dr. King because J. Edgar Hoover tried very hard to do that, putting out all the stories about his extramarital affairs, all right? Now, was there a conspiracy by the very same people? That's another matter. You don't have to have the very same people. You don't have to have the original plot commencing sometime in '63 before the first death occurs of this trio. You just need the same kind of thinking. You just need the same kind of political agenda, and then it'll fall in place. I don't believe this is obviously not the same gunman, and I don't believe necessarily the very same people plotting the deaths. But do I believe the same kinds of people with the same kinds of political philosophy, ultra right-wing, ultra conservative, military, Secret Service type spook organizations, CIA, etc., who could not abide the thought of continuing with the Kennedys and Dr. King? Yes, you bet your life I do believe in that. There can be no question about that. Think what was going on in this country in the 60s in terms of our domestic agenda, civil rights and human rights. Think about what was going on vis-a-vis Russia, the Cold War, Cuba with the Bay of Pigs debacle. Think of what was going on in Vietnam. You know, these were major issues, and the way in which those matters were being addressed and would be addressed by John Kennedy had he lived, by what Dr. King called for, what Senator Kennedy called for, including his last speech, indeed, his victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel. These were going down a political street that those other individuals at the opposite end of the spectrum could not tolerate. And how could they deal with it? This wasn't a ball game, the baseball game. Wait till the 9th inning and see what we do when we come to bat. The 3rd period of the hockey game, the 2nd half of the basketball game. Boy, wait until it's our turn. 13 years going back to John Kennedy, 5 more of him and 8 of Bobby Kennedy. You were looking at a social revolution. You're looking at a socio-political change of dynamic proportions, like it or not. And even as people listen to me, even if they disliked what would have been, fine. That's another matter. I'm not saying you can't have those political thoughts. What I'm saying is you don't deal with them, you don't handle them by eliminating people. Another point I want to make in that regard, who was in charge, essentially, of, shall we call, the National Police Force? J. Edgar Hoover. Not only because he was director of the FBI, which could have intervened and should have intervened in each of these 3 cases, but because of his influence and his power. If he didn't want something done, it wasn't going to be done. With Hoover, whether it was Dallas with JFK, whether it was Memphis with Martin Luther King, or whether it was Los Angeles with RFK, Hoover did not lift a finger and did not suggest any kind of encouragement, and indeed the things that he did, more correctly the things he did not do, strongly suggested, implied, if indeed there was not something expressly stated sub rosa. Fellas, that's it. We know that we've got Oswald, we know we've got James Earl Ray, we know that we've got Sirhan Sirhan. It's all over. Forget about it. Hoover quickly joined in. What does that tell you? Think of the cases, detach yourself from the political ramifications, and just think of these as 3 murders of a complex nature. Let's say, though, they are important people and so on. Let's take even politics out of it. You've got other people around and involved. You've got to determine who the friends and acquaintances and organizations of which these people may be are members, what their own social, political agendas are, and so on. It takes time Just look at any homicide here in Pittsburgh, any little old homicide like that, and especially one that involves somebody of greater importance. You got J. Edgar Hoover mouthing off within hours. He already was telling people on Sunday, November 24th, and a public statement on Monday, November 25th, that the case was all over. He knew that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Forget about it. You had a whole history of Oswald, 2.5 years in Russia, going to Mexico and the Russian embassy. My God, what had to be explored. You take time, a little bit of time, to look at things and see, to learn. Political friends, social friends, family, background, and so on. So it's just incredible that Hoover and those local officials in 3 major cities with experienced trial attorneys, district attorneys, criminal investigators, homicide detectives. My God, there's a world of things to do, of people to question. None of that was done. Those cases were wrapped up. Now, Sirhan Sirhan did last longer. Now, these are facts. I'm stating them publicly. They can be checked.
Former Allegheny County coroner and forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht. Dr. Wecht, thank you so much for being with us.
A pleasure being with you, and maybe we'll talk again.